Hello and welcome to The Advance with Kevin Roberts, a weekly broadcast of the Texas Public Policy Foundation, where we cover the issues facing every American. Though we're headquartered in Austin, Texas, you don't have to be living in Texas to understand that the problems we cover each week are problems facing every American, and I might even say every person on earth. This week's topic is no exception. In fact, this week's topic, which is sort of unearthing, getting into the details of so-called critical race theory, is relevant to every American. It doesn't matter your background. It doesn't matter what state you're in. It doesn't matter your political party. And it doesn't matter your racial or ethnic background, because this is something that is a huge challenge to the very ideals of the United States of America. What we're going to do today is sort of get into the details of that. We're going to analyze what critical race theory is. We're going to analyze where it has become implemented, schools, colleges, businesses, places you might not even expect. And very objectively, we're going to explain why it's such a problem. Because you see, critical race theory, as we will discuss, is not the same thing as talking about America's past in an honest, objective way. I happen to be a historian of early America, and I can tell you in all of the classes that I ever taught, we confronted those challenging episodes like slavery and Reconstruction and Jim Crow segregation honestly, because we believe that's what we need to do as Americans. Critical race theory, to write a headline, actually takes us in reverse. Our two guests this week are national experts on this issue. I have the privilege of working with them every day because they're colleagues here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation. What you will hear from them is expert analysis of the problem, but also, and this is very important, their experiences of battling critical race theory in the trenches. And the reason we're doing this, the reason we're having these guests in particular, is that we want to arm you with the ammunition to fight this nonsense so that together as a country, we can put it to bed. So it's a great privilege to introduce our two guests this week. The first is Lucy Meckler, our campaign manager for Next Generation Texas. That's one of our biggest issue campaigns here at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, focused on young people, on education, and as you might guess, really bad ideas like critical race theory. Our second guest is Dr. Richard Johnson, the executive director of the Booker T. Washington Initiative. As you'll hear from Dr. Johnson, he has a lot of experience in the modern civil rights movement, and he's going to explain, among other things, why critical race theory is such a problem for the gains we've made in the last several decades in this country. So let me get out of the way. Lucy and Richard, thanks for joining us. Lucy, we will turn to you first with the first question. Here we are in Texas, and like most other states, our legislature has tried to deal with the problem of critical race theory. I just want to have you give our audience an overview, not just of what's going on in Texas, but what other state legislatures have done, and for that matter, what's going on at the federal level concerning this issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So about over 24 states have filed a bill relating to critical race theory in attempts to get it out of their schools, their state agencies, or even from contractors who work with state agencies or their school districts. So, I mean, this is a national movement. We don't see it just in Texas. We don't see it just in red states. You know, it's a nationwide movement to try to remove this dangerous ideology from our society, not just from school children. A lot of this is pervasive down from the higher education level. So it's not just a K-12 problem. We see it in academia and law school. It's everywhere that you could possibly think of in government-run institutions, you will find critical race theory. And so states all across the country have filed legislation. I'm going to say about half of them are still in the process in some sort, whether that's passed or continuing to be moved through committee hearings or floor hearings. Some unfortunately have died already, but we're looking forward to seeing those be filed again in in coming years. And what's going to happen with that? We're really staying in touch with states across the country.
Well, Lucy, thanks for that information, and we'll get into a little more detail in terms of how to spot critical race theory in just a moment. But for people who aren't aware, your work on this in Texas, in some other states, and increasingly in DC has been really important. There are a lot of organizations, thank goodness, who are working against this ideology. We don't have enough, I will say that. And I think you would be the first to say we welcome people to join in any capacity. We'll get to that toward the end when we take audience questions. Dr. Richard Johnson, in turning to you now, just to set the stage for our audience, Lucy and I are based here in our Austin office. We both spend some time doing some work in DC. You spend most of your time outside the state capital of Texas, in Houston and other cities. And therefore, you have a perspective that it has to do a little less with government and more with institutions, with small businesses, with churches, with organizations that Americans encounter every single day in their normal lives. I'm curious where you have seen critical race theory, either in individual conversations you've had with others or at sort of the institutional level, which Lucy has just begun to outline.
Critical race theory appears to be, Kevin, coming from the top down in terms of, the individuals who are supporting critical race theory. And that information coming from the top down, higher levels of government down into the community has seeped into the grassroots. And that's where we're starting to see a lot of the folks waking up saying, wait a minute, this is rolling us back. We made significant gains with the Civil Rights Bill in 1964, Voting Rights Act in 1965. Our country has moved forward in terms of looking at individuals and judging them based on the content of their character, not the color of their skin. And we're starting to see this critical race theory get into our K through 12 schools being taught. And it's very subtle. It'll come in the forms of, social justice, equity. In order for this group to feel good, this other group has to feel bad. And so these types of conversations are happening at the K through 12 level, but it's also happening in communities. And most of the folks who really understand our history, just like yourself, I've spent some time. My first degree was in history and government. And so it's really good to know your history. Otherwise, you're doomed to repeat it. And so there are folks out there, unfortunately, a large portion of our population may not know our history and may not be that very well versed. So they're now seeping back into these slogans that come out of critical race theory and said, okay, I'm fighting for social justice. I'm fighting for equity. Well, they've forgotten that we fought for equality and justice for all. And that was the main push of the civil rights movement, was to fight for equality. And because we understand that equity is not a possible goal simply because God gives everybody different gifts, talents, and abilities. And so even though we fight to start off with an equal footing, we may not end up at the same place simply because we're different. And basically, we have to learn how to accept our differences, embrace our differences, and look at the assets of our differences. So critical race theory forces individuals to look through the lens of race, to see the whole world through the lens of race. Either you're Black or you're white. If you're Black, you're oppressed, and if you're white, you're an oppressor. And that is the wrong thing. That's the thing that the civil rights movement was totally against. And so I spent most of my career as a freedom fighter and fighting for equality and justice. Booker T. Washington said it best, and that is everybody cast their buckets down where they are, use their gifts, talents, and abilities to uplift humanity. Martin Luther King said the exact same thing. So I come from that vein of thought. And when I see critical race theory, I see that as an enemy of the civil rights movement and a rollback of all the gains that we have accomplished as American citizens.
Richard, it's eloquently stated. And I want to ask you a quick follow-up question before turning to Lucy, who's one of our resident experts on buzzwords to look for. You've sort of introduced that, but you've also made a really important point. In a lot of ways, I would argue, perhaps it's the most important point. And that is the difference between what the civil rights movement has always had as its big aim, and that is achieving true equality. As you said, emphasizing the content of our character. And contrasting that with what critical race theory wants to do, which is equity. So as succinctly as you can, what's the difference between equality, the noble aim of the civil rights movement, and equity a very sweet sounding supposed aim of critical race theory?
Equity, let's start with equality. Equality says that we all have an equal right. We all have an equal opportunity to grow, flourish, and develop. That's equality. Equity says that we all have to end up at the same place. And so basically, one is an achievable goal and quite naturally understandable coming from a leader like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who was very intelligent, very articulate, and had great foresight, understanding that equality is where our fight lies. Equity, we're going to be different. I'll give you a quick, succinct, example. I have two older sisters. We all grew up in the same household with my mom and my dad. We all had equal opportunity. We all ate the same food. Everything was equal in our house. But my two sisters decided to follow my mom and dad and go into the trades. I decided to get, a college degree and then a master's and a doctorate degree. We all started out at the same place, but we're not all ending up at the same place because we made different decisions with our lives. That's the difference between equality and equity. That's why we fight for equality, and we understand that equity is not the achievable goal because of our individual differences.
Man, that is a great example. In fact, we might ask our audience to do that, if maybe use this in conversations with people who are genuinely trying to understand why critical race theory is so bad. If you grew up in a family with siblings, think about what Richard said, that you're from the same family, you're eating the same food. In other words, you were given what the promise of America is, which is equality of opportunity. And yet, what proponents of critical race theory advocate, if in fact it were implemented to its full philosophical end, would be equity, which is that regardless of how much you did or didn't work, regardless of how good or not of a student you were, regardless of the differences that we have that are just natural, that we're going to guarantee the outcome. And in fact, if you're a person of color, we're going to guarantee a better outcome than if you're white because of history. That's actually not an abusive example of what critical race theory would impose. So, Richard, thanks so much for that. Lucy, I want to turn back to you because one of the things that you're so good at, in fact, you've helped us, your colleagues at the foundation, figure out, is this list of buzzwords that come out of critical race theory. One of them is equity, another is social justice. What could you offer our audience as some things to look out for, whether they're buzzwords or whether there are certain ways that proponents of critical race theory approach trying to implement it in schools and school districts or businesses?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is very important because often proponents of critical race theory don't call it critical race theory, especially because it's under attack now. Generally, people change their terms, so it's harder to identify it in the classroom. So we generally put out a list of buzzwords that helps people identify what to look for where critical race theory and its surrounding ideologies may be taught. And some of those include things like implicit, unconscious, or internalized bias, the relentless search for, racism in every aspect. If it's not there, you got to search harder. Social or restorative justice, the belief that society must be torn down in order to fully root out racism. You get words like systematic racism, where according to critical race theorists, racism is the original sin of America's past and persists in everything we do today. You get words like microaggressions or anti-racism or white privilege, which according to this doctrine says that white people have a certain amount of privilege from their skin tone that benefits them in society. You get similar terms like white fragility or colonialism. And these terms are actually really problematic. One in particular, anti-racism, people generally say from the left that has nothing to do with critical race theory. And I'd say they're fundamentally wrong. There's a really good quote that I think encapsulates this, and that's from Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist. which is basically the pinnacle of where that word came from. And in the book, he says something which is totally alarming and should be alarming to everyone, which says the only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. And the only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Obviously, as Richard had hinted on a little bit earlier, this is not the movement of the civil rights movement. This is not a search for equality. It actually continues discrimination just against a different race, against a different color, and flips what we've traditionally seen on its head. It actually is a new form of racism, I would probably argue.
Well, thanks for that. So Lucy, a follow-up question for you, because one of the things we're trying to accomplish with this particular episode is to encourage people who watch this to take action, but to take action in a way that doesn't waste their time, that's focused on the right target, using the right approach. You're one of the best people to offer that, as is Richard. So Richard, this question's coming to you next. Lucy, though, first, what would you suggest people do if they want to identify where critical race theory is a threat in their lives or their communities and go out and fix it?
Yeah, I would say the first step starts in learning more about what critical race theory is. Watch videos just like this one that helps you understand the concept, and then listen for those buzzwords that I just listed. Those will help you actually identify it in practice. And once you think you found an incident of critical race theory, start at your local level. Talk to, let's say it's your school. Talk to that teacher, talk to the principal, talk to the school board. Slowly run it up the chain if the problem isn't being addressed, but start at the root cause of it. Start where you're actually seeing it in action. And it's most likely that members in your community feel the same exact way you do about critical race theory. And so it's important that you try to gather with those who feel similarly and try to address it at that local level. State policy is, a good idea, but that's not ultimately where it ends. The enforcement mechanism is just people speaking up and saying, we don't want this anymore.
Yeah, thanks for that. Richard, I'm going to come to you with that question momentarily, but first, let me just mention to the audience that if you have a question for us and you haven't yet posed it, you can go into the comment section of wherever you're watching this and ask that question. We'll get to as many audience questions here momentarily as we can. So Dr. Richard Johnson, same question for you. If an audience member is now encouraged, if they're motivated to fight critical race theory, how do they do so?
I would just add to what Lucy just recommended, and once you identify, that there are these subtle involvements of critical race theory in your community, look at and get with folks who have a like mind, who want to fight against racism. And there's a movement right now that's moving across this country to fight against racism, and join in with those noble warriors who are looking to fight against racism in any one of its forms, because basically, that is the main fight. That was the main fight of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. That was the civil rights movement. We were fighting against racism. Now racism has lifted its ugly head, and is coming out of very high places, and we must fight against it, because now you even have the teachers unions who are fighting for critical race theory. They're trying to push critical race theory throughout our schools, our communities, and which will affect our entire way of life. Just a really brief story. One day I was in at the height of my oppression. I was in my upper middle class community, sitting out in my backyard by the swimming pool while I was being very oppressed. And my son was playing video games. He's a computer genius. And I looked at my son, and this was about 10 years ago. I looked at my son, and I grew up in an all-Black neighborhood. All three of my degrees were historically Black colleges and universities. So my surroundings were a whole lot different than his. He grew up in a community, a multicultural community. All of his friends are of different races, ethnicities. And I looked at him and I said, man, I have to ask you a question. And so he's playing this game. So he stops, he looks at me. I said, hey, I grew up in a one culture community. You grew up in a multicultural community. how is it? I mean, is there a difference? So he stopped and he looked and he began to search his mind. I could see him searching every corner of his mind. Then he stopped and said something to me so profound. He said, "Dad, I don't have a point of reference." I said, "Martin Luther King, you guys did it. During my time growing up, I had multiple points of reference. Just in one generation, I could sit down and talk to my son, Richard Andrew Johnson IV, and he had no point of reference. He judged all of his friends based on their character. It had nothing to do with their skin tone. That is worth fighting for. And when I see critical race theory coming up, that to me is a tool to erase the gains that the civil rights movement have given us as a nation. And we must fight against it. We must organize. It's hard to mobilize unless you organize. Organize at the local level, what Lucy was saying, you organize at the local level, and we mobilize against it, and we fight it in every area that it shows up.
Richard, thanks for that personal story. I was going to ask you, as you were telling that story, a follow-up question that would I be correct in summarizing that your generation, to some extent, my generation, will let other people decide who's older. Let's just say our generation, regardless of the color of our skin, work toward the promise of what Dr. King so eloquently stated in 1963, which is, let's focus on the content of our character. Let us be willing to dream as Americans to guarantee the promissory note of the Declaration of Independence, which is that all men are created equal, including women, as we understood the founders to mean. And that our children's generation actually has lived that because of the struggles of the previous two generations. But I didn't even have to ask that question because you much more eloquently explained it. So thanks so much for sharing that story. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and if I would add one other thing, it's the importance of studying history. If we could elevate and amplify the necessity to study our history, because again, if you don't know your history, you're doomed to repeat it. Most of us who really know our history fight against critical race theory simply because we don't want to be rolled back. We've been there before. America has grown beyond that. America has grown into the space of all men are created equal. Let's fight for that.
It's the greatest thing worth fighting for every generation in America. Thank you. So, Lucy, I'm going to field the first audience question to you. And this is about critical race theory's advance in public schools. This audience member asks, if critical race theory continues to prevail, should parents be pulling their child out of public school? Is homeschool or charter school preferable?
Yeah, I think actually critical race theory has been a catalyst for school choice and opportunity for students to get an education that may better suit them. Families have rapidly pulled their children out of schools where this is being taught. It can be taught in any type of school, but you more frequently generally see that in a public school setting or traditional public school setting. There is a mass influx of students wanting to go to charter schools or private schools or even homeschool. We've seen the homeschool community, double, not just from the pandemic, but also from this type of ideology that's going into the classroom. And parents don't really see themselves having an alternative. They're, fighting for their kids' future and the understanding of history and civics and what it means to be an American. And those fundamental questions, can help determine that kid's future. And so parents would rather pull their kids out of these schools and transfer them into a school that doesn't teach this type of ideology than remain inside it.
Yeah, that's well said. We're looking at the questions coming in from the audience. Y'all have done a good job of answering some of the questions here. What is the best argument against critical race theory? We've talked about that. Equality versus equity. We've talked about the most effective way a parent can combat critical race theory in their kids' classrooms. Nice job. So Richard, I want to push this next question to you, but Lucy, I'm going to send it to you as well. This audience member asks, can people who are not yet parents do anything to combat critical race theory? If so, how?
Absolutely. You don't have to be a parent to fight against racism. you know, you can be, I was a little kid, fighting against racism, because basically that's what critical race theory is. It's a tool of racism. And we want to make sure that the first thing that you do once you identify there are concerned parents, there are concerned members of your community, there are civic organizations in your community that are fighting against, this idea of being, if you're Black, you're oppressed, if you're white, you're an oppressor. There are groups all over the country now springing up to fight against critical race theory and racism in any form. So look to join in with those organizations. Do your homework. I suggest that you read up on critical race theory. Make sure you're very well versed on it. We were very well versed on issues in the civil rights movement. We read those documents. That's the reason why we fell in love with the Declaration of Independence, and we fell in love with the Constitution, because we read those documents. We understood the promise of America. And that same promise of America then is the promise of America now that is being threatened by critical race theory. And so find groups in your local communities, join in with them and fight in this movement.
Yeah, really good. In a lot of ways, we're right now, if we're thinking about this generation or this era that we're all living through, we're living out the American dream, regardless of who we are, regardless of where our people came from, more than any other people ever in the history of the world. And it is both an irony and a tragedy that we're having to fight something, an ideology that's really trying to undermine that. So, but Lucy, same question for you. If someone is not a parent and they're concerned about critical race theory, where do they harness their energy? Where do they focus to try to fight against it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the coolest thing in my mind is that you do not have to be a parent to run to be a state board member. Most people think that you have to be a parent or a grandparent or have someone in that school within your district to run, and you do not. As long as you live within that school district, you can run to be a board member. Because your tax dollars are going to fund that school. So you should be able to have a say in what's being taught. Another way that people can get involved if they're not a parent is just reaching out to legislators and sharing this information that you find or research within your district or their district. Often legislators say if a state legislator, if they get 5 calls on a certain bill, that's a lot. So if you're someone who's not a parent and 5 people, that could change the way that legislation is passed in your state. So I think getting involved on those 2 areas are definitely ways that non-parents can get involved in the fight.
Yeah, really good advice y'all have given. Well, we're getting down to time where we just have a couple more questions. I'll take the first of these and I'll explain why, because y'all are much better on almost every other question. And then I'm going to field the last most important question to both of you as a way of closing our broadcast. This next question comes from an audience member who apparently is well read in philosophy, including some philosophy which is really trashy. And I'll explain that in a minute. But the question is, I often hear critical race theory being described as Marxist. Isn't it really more an outgrowth of postmodernism? I will spare our audience members the pointy-headed academic response, but given where I went to school at the University of Texas, which is known sometimes as left of center, I had to do a lot of postmodern theory reading, and I can tell you, audience member, you're spot on. In fact, critical race theory is directly an outgrowth of postmodernism. And the quick thing to understand there, and it's relevant to everybody, even if you hate philosophy, is that postmodernists more than anything believe in deconstructing the reality around us. That the only reality that exists is whatever we conjure in our mind. And so that could include oppression. Even if you grew up in a very poor white family, you're still an oppressor. So you're right. Having said that, critical race theory has a lot of tendencies that are neo-Marxist, tendencies that want to pit, in an overly simple way, one group of people against another. not quite the proletariat and bourgeoisie, as Marx would say, but in very similar ways. And probably the greatest example of that in practice is what Black Lives Matter used to post on their website and took down because of some criticism. So you can read much more about that in some of the publications we have coming out soon. We're going to be doing a series, not just on critical race theory, but on the philosophical roots of that, just 2-pagers. So if you find philosophy boring, and most of it you should, in fact, most modern philosophy is worth just setting a match to and using it as a fire starter. You can at least go to texaspolicy.com and learn a lot more. We'll move to the last question for both of you, Lucy and Richard, and that is a question that's rooted in some pessimism. This audience member asks, isn't this too far gone? Isn't critical race theory in too many places for us to fight it? And if we're going to lose that battle, haven't we lost America? Lucy, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I would say it's never too late. You see this movement sweeping across the country of people who don't believe in racism and believe in equality that Martin Luther King Jr. espoused. And if those people are standing up now, there is still time for us to take back our country and live out those founding values that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution talk about. The founding fathers believed that the one thing that unites us, our humanity, can overcome anything that divides us, including race. And so I think there's definitely still opportunity for us to save that. And you see these parent movements sweeping all over the country, groups popping up to help fight, solely dedicated to fight critical race theory. And if it was truly over, there would be no room for those groups, those parents, those thoughts to be had.
Yeah, thank you for that. Richard?
I would say to that audience member that now is a great time to be living in America, simply because the giant is waking up. Whenever you wake up the giant, now you can really see the power and potency and the strength of that giant. We had become a little asleep. I mean, we rested because, the civil rights movement had given us our gains. I mean, racism had laid down and took a nap, and we took a nap along with it, and then it woke up. Now we're waking up. And so I think what we're seeing right now is an awakening going on, as Lucy mentioned, all around the country. Groups are popping up to fight against critical race theory and racism, in our nation. And I believe that we're winning this fight, and we're going to win this fight. No, it's not over by the stretch of nobody's imagination. The giant is just waking up, and I'm glad to be in the fight. And as a matter of fact, I know a lot of other folks I've talked to out in the communities now are saying, look, we must organize, mobilize against this. And so at the end of the day, we're going to win this battle. And that's the confidence I like to leave the audience with. At the end of the day, we're going to win this battle, just like we won this battle in the civil rights movement. We're going to win this battle again. And Martin said something profound, and this speaks to who should be involved at any level. One cannot begin to live until he can rise above the narrow confinements of his own individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. God says we're human beings, and we are part of humanity. Doesn't matter what your skin tone is or your skin color. And God gives us what? Equal rights in this humanity that we have. We're winning this fight because we have the supreme being on our side.
Well, thanks, Richard, for that. Lucy, for your optimism as well. And I'll just underscore that while it is a heck of a fight, and I think we're all disappointed that fellow Americans would believe a lie. That's what critical race theory is. They would believe in something that is actually undermining the progress we've made as a people, a very pluralistic, very diverse people, that we are winning. And the evidence of that winning is in school board races being won by people who never thought, to Lucy's point just now, that they would even throw their hat in the ring for any elective office. We're winning because the organizations that are proposing this, that are promoting it, are losing in almost every legislative battle they fight. It's going to take a while. Coming from a former higher ed guy, I know I can speak for Richard too, given his similar experience, for us to win that battle there, but we've got them on the run too. So I just want to encourage all of you who have viewed this to get out and do your part, however small, in fighting against critical race theory. It really does begin, as our two guests, Lucy Meckler and Dr. Richard Johnson, mentioned, by reading more about it. And I hope that we've given you an introduction and maybe a little bit more into it and to why it's such a problem. I'm going to leave you with this. You can't love what you don't know. And the best way to love America is to know it. We have many documents, many speeches that we could read. Clearly, the best one, the most relevant one for this issue is Martin Luther King's 1963 I Have a Dream speech. If you haven't read that, or it's been a while since you've read it, or maybe you were an 8th grader or a 10th grader and you skimmed it just for the sake of class, do yourself a favor, do your neighbor a favor, do your country a favor, and go reread that speech. And after you've read the text and you're moved by it, then watch Dr. King deliver it or listen to him deliver it. And if you don't have goosebumps and you don't tear up over the beauty of those words, because they are so true and their relevance to what we are fighting against in critical race theory, then maybe, just maybe, you don't know enough about America's founding principles. Please do that. We'll send you some links as we post this episode and the follow-up. I really encourage every American to go back and do that, because I am convinced that if all 330 million of us did that, critical race theory would not exist tomorrow. It is that dangerous a concept. It is as bad as every dangerous ideology this country has ever fought. The problem is that it's an ideology that has come from within. Thanks for watching. Thanks again to Lucy Meckler and Richard Johnson for such an excellent episode. Tune in next week where we'll tackle another really small issue and where we'll offer some solutions and how you can help. Take care.